Hey, DawgNation, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. I think we're going to have a really fun show today. I want to deal with a few things that I did not hear as much about during SEC Media Days as I would have liked. Now, if you're a Georgia player or a coach, Kirby Smart, who was there, I'm sure you feel like you probably talked yourself to death, but I think there was still some conversation left to be had that I didn't hear as much of. There's also a debate that got going yesterday between the Alabama side, the Clemson side, Georgia kind of weirdly in the middle of all of that. We'll deal with that on today's program. For those of you who've been wishing we had more recruiting stuff this week focused on SEC Media Days, I'll give you an update from Jeff Sintel that he provided for us yesterday on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger. I've got a lot on the sheet here. We got a lot planned. We'll see if we can roll through it here over the course of the next hour. I'm glad you're with us as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Georgia has a pretty good video department. They do some kind of cool stuff. And one of the things that they did, I don't know when they did it, I saw it this morning, was kind of a recap from their perspective of SEC Media Days. This is Kirby and Fromm and Andrew Thomas and J.R. Reed all getting on the plane, leaving Athens, flying in. And you kind of see over their shoulder as they walk from interview to interview. Many of these I was a part of at SEC Media Days this week. And when you see this as shot from the perspective of the Georgia coach and a few of the Georgia players, you realize how wild a whirlwind experience this must be. It must be just maddening to have people like me who stick microphones in your face and, as you probably heard, shout the way that I seem to do when I go to events like this, shout at them. I'm sure when it's all said and done, their head's probably spinning. Their eyes may be spinning around in the back of their head a little bit as well. They probably feel like they've talked themselves to death. And yet, for someone like me who never seems to tire of the conversation of Georgia football, there were a few things at SEC Media Days I didn't quite hear as much about as I would have liked to when it comes to the perspective of the Georgia Bulldogs. And in particular, what I mean is there's this one thing that everybody talks about, and yet there's this slightly different thing that I think may either be more interesting or more important when it comes to Georgia's pursuit of a national championship this year. Let me see if I can give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. The one thing that, and if you're watching on video, you see Kirby Smart on your screen right now. In that video that you're watching, he is very likely talking about how Georgia compares to Alabama and what it takes for Georgia to get over the hump versus Alabama. For those of you that watch some of this coverage on television or have been a part of our DawgNation content over the last couple of days, I think you would all agree that the ad nauseum discussion around Georgia and Kirby Smart in particular is, what do you do in those late season games against Alabama? What do you do to get over the hump versus the Crimson Tide? And this is obvious for a number of reasons. Kirby coached there. There's a unique connection there. Kirby made a coaching blunder in the game last year with the fake punt. That puts a little extra pressure on him to answer questions like this, and this is just the way the football talk goes this time of year. However, for as much attention that gets paid to Alabama, I don't believe that's the most significant issue facing Georgia from a scheduling standpoint. Now, obviously, it's the game Georgia's got to win, but when I look at the way that Georgia's played against the Crimson Tide, I see that as more of a validation of what Kirby Smart's built over the last 3 years, more so than I see that as some sort of, to use a bigger word than I should be using, repudiation of what's still wrong with Georgia. And I know the fourth quarters didn't include a whole lot of offense, and I know that Georgia let those leads slip away, and I know there's no shortage of people, both famous and just rank-and-file fans, who will say that Georgia choked those games away against the Crimson Tide, with Jalen Hurts coming in last year, with Tua Tagovailoa coming to the game the year before. I get all of that, and I understand that. But when I think about my own experience cheering for Georgia, covering Georgia, talking with each of you every day about Georgia, to me, the thing that gives me the most pause about what Georgia might do this year and the most, I guess, opportunity to reconsider what is, for me, a situation in which I think Georgia goes 12-0 in the regular season, has a great chance to win the national championship. The thing that causes me to almost reconsider that is not, well, is Georgia going to get over the hump versus Alabama, and is it going to close those games out better in 2019? That's not it. For me, the two games that stick out more so than the losses to the Crimson Tide are what happened on the road in 2017 at Auburn and on the road last year at LSU. It's how Georgia has responded in hostile road environments that I think is the actual biggest question facing Georgia, and maybe the biggest reason to at least pause for a moment before predicting this team to go all the way, because it is the hole in the resume right now. On the road against SEC West teams, you can go back and include 2016 versus Ole Miss on this if you want to as well, an average team that dominated Georgia that day. That's the thing we need to see more of from Georgia, and that's one of the things that I wish was talked about more during SEC Media Days this week. Now, for what it's worth, and in all fairness, I did get a chance to ask Jake Fromm about that. What does it take for Georgia to do better in a tough road environment? It'll see one in November against Auburn. It may see one in early October against Tennessee, depending on how much Vols fans believe in their team right now. What's it going to take for Georgia to be better in those spots this year than it was in Death Valley against LSU a season ago, and the late November game against Auburn the season before that? And Jake Fromm gave his thoughts and answer to that question. Here's what Jake said then.
Right. For us, we look at those games where we didn't quite get over the hump in the past, and we want to do more this summer. And I think it starts with what we do in the off season, in the summer, how do we prepare, how we condition, how we attack camp, when it comes, and really taking every single game like it's our last, and trying to go 1-0 every single week.
So obviously that's kind of a football, almost coach speak, player speak compared to a coach speak type of answer from Jake Fromm, and frankly, he doesn't owe me much more than that. He's not under any kind of obligation. He's not sworn under oath here. He's not under any kind of obligation to give me more details than that, but admittedly, there aren't a lot of specific details from Fromm on that, and my hope is, and for Georgia fans, I think your hope on this as well, is that privately there are a lot more specific and intense conversations going on about this, because, listen, Georgia has just been a different team when it's been in a stadium that's been intense. Now you say, what about the road win at Notre Dame? That stadium that year in 2017 was filled with about half Georgia fans. So let's face it, that wasn't that hostile of a road environment. And Georgia played so well against Tennessee in 2017 that it pretty much took the crowd out of the game. And there are other examples of that as well. When Georgia's really, seen the teeth of a big-time crowd against a big-time opponent, it hasn't played all that well. National champions don't take weeks off in that regard, and this year, when Georgia goes into tough stadiums against good teams, it's going to have something to prove. And while that didn't get talked about a lot during SEC Media Days, my guess is going to be talked about a good bit as you head throughout the season, especially when these dates pop up on the calendar. Another topic that got talked about, but maybe not as much as I would like for it to have been, or maybe not as specifically as I would have liked for it to have been addressed, is what's going on at wide receiver. Now, listen, the topic of wide receivers for Georgia came up a lot when they were there at SEC Media Days in Hoover, Alabama on Tuesday. But it's really more about what Georgia does to replace the guys it knew it had lost, the ones that went into the NFL like Terry Godwin and Riley Ridley and McCole Hardman, and then adding to that the surprise departure of J.J. Holloman, who, as you know, was dismissed from the team a few weeks ago because of an incident that happened way back in 2018. There was a lot of talk about how Georgia replaces those, and to Jake Fromm's credit, he's taking responsibility to make sure that he helps get those guys up to speed. Here's an example of him talking about that.
Right, there's a lot of snaps, a lot of yards, a lot of touchdowns that, have been, products of players who are not with us anymore. So we have a lot of guys who are ready to step up. They're scratching their claw and they're working and they're doing a great job. So we're excited to see what they can do this fall for us and go to work and ready for them to make some plays. I think they're ready.
So he says that he thinks they're ready there, and in the midst of that discussion, he also goes on to mention a specific wide receiver by name that he thinks might be ready to step up. Here is more from Jake talking about one of the hot topics when it comes to wide receivers.
There's a number of guys in that room who could step up to that number one spot. I think Tyler Simmons has done a great job of being a leader and being a great older player in that room, and he's doing a good job of taking over. So, I think he's going to do a good job leading. I think a lot of other guys are going to step up and make plays, and there's a ton of talent in that room, and just ready for them to go out and show it.
So obviously what Fromm says there is an example of what you heard from a lot at SEC Media Days, talking about how Georgia replaces what's lost. But the topic that I don't think got covered enough, and the topic that here on DawgNation Daily we've tried to discuss, is not just how Georgia replaces what was lost, but how it also takes that next step towards having the kind of dominant receiver core that a team like Clemson has and used to its advantage to win a championship a year ago. A team like what Alabama had in 2017 and still has right now with the Blitnikoff winner, Jerry Jeudy, and others. For Georgia, the issue in 2019, for me, is not just what do you do to replace J.J. Holloman, what do you do to replace the guys who are now in the NFL. It's also what do you do to take that next step as a receiving core. I talked to Kirby Smart about this in kind of a private media session that I'm sure you'll read more about at DawgNation.com, and he admitted, yes, Georgia does have to be balanced. You don't necessarily have to have the 1,000-yard receiver the way that Clemson's had that, the way that Alabama has that, but you need to have a collection of guys who can put up big numbers, and I would also say on that, bigger numbers than what Georgia has done in the past. We really haven't seen a receiver in the Kirby Smart era eclipse that low 700-yard mark. That's what Javon Wims did in 2017, but national champions for the most part have had big-time productivity from the wide receiver position. And as good as Georgia is running the ball and as big as this Georgia offensive line is, I don't think that Georgia's disqualified from that discussion either. It needs an upgrade in its receiver performance if it wants to win a national championship in 2019. And my guess is, while that wasn't talked about a ton during SEC Media Days, it is going to be talked about a lot as we head towards the season. Let me do one more of these here really quick. On defense, going back to spring practice and in SEC Media Days as well, we heard a lot about havoc plays. By now, we all know what those are. Sacks, tackles for loss, passes broken up, interceptions, the kinds of things that can cause problems for defense. But I've told you all many times that I think statistically speaking, it's not just the lack of havoc that held back the Georgia defense a year ago. It was the inability to be consistent at stopping the run week in and week out. That, to me, is a crucial area facing Georgia towards its national championship. I would have liked to have seen more talk about that at SEC Media Days. Once again, though, credit to a Georgia player, J.R. Reed, who was willing to go down that road and give his thoughts on what it's going to take for Georgia to get better in that regard. Here's what Reed said.
Well, one of the reasons why we weren't great were just missed tackles and missed opportunities. And if we can just make those tackles in the backfield or just make those first impact contact tackles, not just bring the guy down, but wrapping them up and waiting till guys get there to help, it'll definitely help out the team.
So let me do a quick bottom line on all this here. We talk about the havoc plays on defense, but I think it's the need to get better against the run that deserves more discussion. We talk about replacing what Georgia lost at wide receiver, and yet I think it's the need to also upgrade that position from a statistical profile. That's a crucial step towards winning a national championship. And the same goes as well for the dominant narrative about what Georgia hasn't done thus far against Alabama. That may be the kinds of thing that everybody wants to ask Kirby and the players questions about. But what Georgia does on the road against other SEC West opponents before it gets to that game against Alabama, I think that is at least as important, if not more so, in determining just how good Georgia truly is. There are a lot of expectations facing the Dogs this season, and the questions you heard on Tuesday reflect that. The great news is Georgia's not shying away from any of that talk whatsoever, but the overall story of how the Dogs are going to get there, maybe that didn't get quite as much attention as I would have liked on Tuesday. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Good to have you with us today, live on video, however you get to us. 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're on the radio at noon, of course, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Just really glad to have you as a part of DawgNation Daily here today. By the way, speaking of DawgNation.com, hope you'll go there and check out information on DawgNation Days of Summer. It is coming up the next big event for us on Thursday, August 1st, there at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. Now, if you're watching on video, you see a great example of one of the things that makes Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa so much fun. Great golf. There's a chance for you to play with us on Friday. We got a couple spots left on that if you want to be in on that. We're going to have a terrific event open to the public that night at 6 p.m. That means even if you're not staying with us, you can come and be a part of the event there that night at 6 p.m. Many of you, though, have already made your plans to get your room, be with us, and have a great time, and that's really exciting to hear. Those of you that are going to be a part of our VIP reception that night at 5 p.m., I can't wait to share that with you. And for those of you who wish you could have gotten in on that, well, there's one more big chance to. It's our giveaway, courtesy of Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. Someone's going to be a big winner of a VIP stay to Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa, but you've got to go to DawgNation.com, and you've got to get registered for your chance right now. So click in to the DawgNation Days of Summer tab. It's a really easy thing to find, and you should be able to be in on that and have a great time. Oh, what an incredible thing it's going to be. DawgNation Days of Summer coming up on Thursday, August 1st at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. I cannot wait to see all of you there. All right. We have a fun interview coming up on our program in just a moment. I'll tell you more about that in a bit. For now, though, let me go around the doghouse here today, brought to you by Online Trading Academy. And obviously, SEC Media Days continues to be a hot topic from the this week. And yesterday, despite the fact that Georgia was not there, Georgia became a bit of a catalyst for a debate in the college football world. It all started when Alabama linebacker Dylan Moses was asked to say the toughest game that he's played in college football thus far. And if you're a Georgia fan, I think you'll be interested in Moses' answer. Here's what he had to say.
The toughest game I played in was the Georgia game last year in the SEC Championship. And the reason I say that is because it was a very aggressive game on both sides of the ball. Georgia came with it, we came with it. And I just remember, after that game, I just felt like I got into a brawl. My entire body was hurting. Took me a couple of days to get back healthy and all that, to take care of myself. But that was one of the hardest games I ever played in.
So if you're a Georgia fan, even though the Dogs did not win that game, you may feel a little bit of a sense of like you were complimented, like you were flattered, the fact that Moses says that game was that tough on me. But as it turns out, those words from Moses weren't received all that well at ACC Media Days, which is also going on this week, and some Clemson fans and some Clemson players had a little bit of a problem with that, and all of a sudden there's a debate going on, which Georgia unwittingly finds itself right there in the middle of. We'll talk about that more in our program coming up. For now, though, let me remind you that Around the Doghouse brought to you by our friends at Online Trading Academy, and the best decision you can make, I think, is the decision to invest in yourself. That means learning how the markets work and making them work in your advantage. That's what Online Trading Academy provides. Your chance to learn about a variety of trading styles or a spectrum of asset classes, both in the classroom and online. Online Trading Academy makes it all really easy, and they're going to increase your knowledge every single day. So make sure you take that step to invest in yourself, learn about the markets. Go to this website, tradingacademy.com/Atlanta. I have a tendency to talk fast sometimes, so let me make sure you understand. It's trading with a D, tradingacademy.com/Atlanta, and find out how Online Trading Academy can set you up for success in the markets. You'll be really happy that you did do that. And it's great to have you with us here on DawgNation Daily. All right, so I want to set you up now before we kind of get back into the discussion about what happened yesterday with Dylan Moses and how that impacted Georgia. Let me kind of set you up here for a moment for a special conversation. I wanted to make sure our DawgNation Daily audience had a chance to hear this. I was lucky enough to get a chance to talk to the SEC Network's Paul Feinbaum earlier this week, and Paul is one of those guys that I think probably knows the landscape around the SEC as well as anyone. And Paul, I think, in addition to knowing a lot of the coaches personally and obviously getting to know the players over the course of their career, the one thing that Paul has also made himself a bit of an expert on, and listen, he's a guy that kind of shouts some hot takes from here and there, and that's not everybody's cup of tea, and not everybody listening and watching right now likes Paul Feinbaum, and I totally get that. But the one thing that Paul does remain keenly aware of, and this is one thing I think you ought to give him some credit for, even if he's not necessarily your favorite personality around the SEC, one thing that Paul takes a lot of effort to make sure he's up to date on is the feelings of fans, what fans are thinking, and what the narratives around the SEC are. Paul keeps his finger on that pulse as much as anybody in all of college football does. So to talk to him about his opinion, the thing that you understand about that is, in large measure, this is informed by what he's hearing from the folks who call his show or the folks who stop him in Hoover, Alabama, and SEC Media Days, want to give him a piece of their mind. That all goes into the stuff that Paul Feinbaum says about college football. And in this particular discussion here, it's pretty brief. It's not going to be very long. But in this particular discussion, the thing a Georgia fan is going to like about this, I think, is twofold. On the one hand, I think that Paul kind of turns on its side what has been, as I said before, the dominant narrative involving Kirby Smart. That, hey, there's extreme pressure to get over the hump this year, to win that national championship, and vanquish that foe that is the Alabama Crimson Tide. Paul Feinbaum has a slightly different take on that in this discussion. And in addition to that, the other thing that I think a Georgia fan is going to find very interesting is some extraordinarily complimentary things that Paul has to say about Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm. So I want to give you a chance to hear this. I will warn you, as I said before, when we get into these public venues with a lot of people in the room, I have a tendency to talk a little loud. I guess this is another example of that, so let me apologize in advance for that. But nonetheless, Paul Feinbaum sharing some pretty provocative opinions about UGA. I wanted you to be able to hear this as a part of DawgNation Daily, and of course it's great to have you as a part of the program.
I think the fact that he's built Georgia up. I mean, Brandon, I find this narrative that Kirby Smart has somehow missed his moment to be patently ridiculous. He's been there 3 years. Most of this is fairly well known to your audience, but he's won an SEC championship. He's won a Rose Bowl. He nearly won a national championship, and he's recruiting at the highest level in college football. So, I mean, what more do Georgia fans want? I don't really think many are saying this. I think sometimes this is a media narrative, but I just got through talking to Kirby on our set inside, and he seems pretty relaxed. I thought today he looked like a coach that had been in the SEC as a head coach for 20 years. He was smooth. He was calm. He was just absolutely brilliant, I felt, in his presentation, especially the way he answered the Saban question, the pressure questions at the UA. He handled the questions better than I'm handling yours.
With that in mind, what's the missing ingredient for Georgia right now?
I think it's just a matter of finishing a game. And you look back. I mean, Georgia reminds me a little bit of Federer on Sunday. He played almost a near perfect match. I mean, he served for the Wimbledon title twice. He outmaneuvered Djokovic in every imaginable way, and he still lost. And I think that's what Georgia has done in the 2 games against Alabama.
Let's do one more thing before we let you go. When you look at Jake Fromm in comparison to Tua Tagovailoa, Trevor Lawrence has won national championship with Clemson. What do you see in terms of Fromm's game and where he needs to take his level of play to be what Tua has been for Bama and what Lawrence has been for Clemson?
I think just a little steadier under pressure. But I think of those 3, he is the best leader. I think Jake has total command of that team. I felt Kirby said something interesting today, and I really never thought about that. He has a little bit of Tim Tebow in him, and I agree, having spent 5 years traveling with Tim. And I just think, what made Tebow great was he willed his team to win. And I think the one ingredient we haven't seen yet, and I think we may very well see this year, is Jake Fromm has to, when the opportunity is there, to will his team to victory as opposed to allow it to slip away.
I think what Paul says there about Jake Fromm is really interesting, and I'll tell you why I feel that way. I'll be the first to tell you, I don't agree with every single word that comes out of Paul Feinbaum's mouth, nor do I think anyone agrees with all the words anyone speaks. Even those of you that listen and watch this show every single day, you don't always agree with me. That's just the way the college football conversations go. We all have strong opinions, and almost no one's opinion is going to match up evenly and equally over the course of time. So we'll have our disagreements with Paul from time to time, but here's the one thing I'm willing to say in his defense. Because he has this prominent position on the SEC network and because people are paying close attention to everything that he says, I think that Paul, even when he kind of veers in the direction of a hot take, I think he knows that he kind of has to be careful to make sure that what he does truly say is a reflection of his opinion because people are going to notice it and they're going to call him out on it. I think that he has to be careful to make sure that he's willing to stand behind the opinions that he gives. So when Paul says that he believes that Jake Fromm is the superior leader in comparison to Tua Tagovailoa and Trevor Lawrence, my assumption is that he means that. And I think we start to see now, as we move towards junior season for Fromm, junior season for Tagovailoa, sophomore campaign for Trevor Lawrence, I think we start to see something other than just the typical default setting when it comes to Georgia and Fromm in particular. If you look at all the preseason rankings, it's either Clemson or Alabama 1 and 2, and then Georgia just kind of rubber stamped in there at 3. If you look at the ranking for top quarterbacks in all of college football, now there are other guys besides these 3, but in some form or fashion, it's either Tua and Lawrence, and then you get to Fromm somewhere around the 3rd best quarterback in college football. That's just kind of the way Fromm is treated is very similar to the way that Georgia is treated. It's, well, we know it's Alabama and Clemson, and then it's probably Georgia right behind that. We know it's either Tua or Lawrence, and it's like Jake Fromm somewhere just below them, right behind them on that list. But Paul Feinbaum there says, no, there's one aspect in watching Fromm closely that I think he's actually an improvement upon what Tua Tagovailoa brings to the table and what Trevor Lawrence brings to the table, and that is with his leadership quality. It's that, and I sometimes don't like these phrases because they're difficult to define, it's that quote-unquote it factor. It's that intangible gamer quality, that special quality that makes Jake Fromm more than just what his stats are on the field. And sometimes, as I said before, that can be difficult to define, and therefore it's difficult to know if it really means anything. But Feinbaum seems to think that it does, and I do think that gives you a path forward for Georgia here this season. Because let's face it, we just spent a few minutes talking about wide receivers, and my belief that it's not just the receiver position that needs to match what Georgia did a year ago and replace the names that are no longer there, but it's also a situation which the Georgia receiving corps needs to upgrade just a bit, needs to be better than it was a year ago. Well, how do you do that given so little experience? Well, part of that's been through recruiting and bringing in an impressive crop of guys. Also, part of that is the responsibility that Fromm bears to make sure he gets those guys up to speed. And I'll invite you to go back and listen to the Tuesday edition of DawgNation Daily, the one we aired late on video. Some of you may not have seen it, or on podcast. Maybe by now you've heard that. Fromm was very willing to talk about what he needs to do, what he's already been doing this summer. So when Paul says that he thinks that Jake may be a better leader than those other two guys, that leadership might be something that Georgia can really use to its advantage this year. I don't think that's meaningless conjecture necessarily, and I don't think that's just another compliment tossed Fromm's way. It may be that leadership, that so-called it factor, the kind of thing that Fromm has been showing since 2017, that if Georgia does get over the hump and win that national championship, it may need more than just the tangible talent that we can all obviously see on the field, some of those intangible qualities that gave Fromm a chance to step on the field after Jacob Eason got hurt. That may be a big part of the formula there this season. I also think it's interesting to hear Paul kind of take some of the pressure off Kirby Smart just a bit, and you heard that at the very beginning of that discussion. If anything, a guy like him who does a radio show every day and on the SEC network, kind of a televised version of that radio show, he's got a professional opportunity to not take the pressure off anybody, because ratings go up, eyeballs and ears gather closer to the devices when there is a kind of a pressure cooker around a coach, when it is put up or shut up, prove what you're all about, or kind of get off the stage. If anything, Paul Feinbaum's got a motivation financially, economically, to keep the pressure on Kirby Smart. But he says, no, listen, this is not necessarily just a one-year story for UGA and Smart. They're not going anywhere regardless of what happens in 2019. I think that's also true. Now, I'm also of the belief that this may be the year that Georgia does truly get over the hump, but whether they win it this season or not, I don't think Georgia's status as a national championship contender on the very shortest of short lists for being able to get that done, I don't think that changes at all after 2019, whether some of the juniors like Jake Fromm leave or not. And it was really interesting to hear Paul Feinbaum echo that as well. Let me do one more thing kind of before we change the subject here as well. And, of course, I really appreciate Paul Feinbaum being with us as a part of our DawgNation coverage of SEC Media Days. Let me go back in time to address what I was talking about a moment ago in our Around the Doghouse feature brought to you by Online Trading Academy, where I mentioned what Dylan Moses said, and he kind of calls out Georgia as the toughest opponent that Alabama played. Other players kind of echoed that. You could read more about that from Mike Griffith at DawgNation.com, and then those words kind of travel all their way to the ACC Media Days, which is ongoing this week as well. And then you got Clemson players say, well, guess what? You say George was the toughest opponent you played all season long. We think Notre Dame was the toughest opponent we played all season long. So essentially the way that Dylan Moses was seemingly not willing to give credit to Clemson, the team that beat the Crimson Tide, for being the toughest opponent it played, you got Clemson kind of playing the same game saying, well, we also think our other opponent, Notre Dame, was the toughest opponent that we played. Now, what does all of this mean? First of all, I think it's really interesting that Georgia just kind of sits here as almost a pawn in this game between Clemson and Alabama. It is a pretty good indication, I think, of the way in which Georgia, because it has lost head-to-head to Alabama, because it hasn't faced Clemson in a head-to-head matchup, doesn't probably quite get the credit it's due in terms of being not just a two-team race for the national championship, but at the very least a three-team race, with Georgia statistically a lot closer to Clemson than some people realize, and obviously within a eyelash of beating Alabama a couple of times. This kind of debate back and forth where the Georgia resume, the toughness of Georgia, is used as kind of a serve and volley back and forth between these two teams. I think it is an example of maybe Georgia not getting as much credit as it possibly should. But the other thing I think you got to address here is when we heard George at SEC Media Days on Tuesday, we didn't hear anything at all that could have been misconstrued, that could have been twisted, even by a media that has a motivation to make a controversy out of nothing. Georgia just did not really give that. I mean, I've played you a few clips now from Jake Fromm, including the interviews from Fromm, Thomas, and Reed going back to Tuesday, Kirby Smart himself. There's not a whole lot you can do with that to kind of turn that into bulletin board material, flashy headlines. You just can't do that. And as frustrating at times as that can be for a person like me that does something for a living where interesting quotes from coaches and players makes the job a little easier and makes the attention for an event like SEC Media Days a little more intense, Georgia's just not going to give that. And I said it earlier the week that Georgia, when it goes to a place like this, certainly is a classy representation of the university. Guys are dressed well. Guys speak well. Kirby Smart's comfortable in his own skin right now. He's not trying to be something that he's not, and that's a pretty good look overall. By comparison, is it fair to ask if Dylan Moses, when he's asked the question, it was an open-ended question. It was not a, hey, was Georgia the toughest opponent you played? It was a UGA reporter, a guy that covers UGA, I should say, that asked the question. It was an open-ended question with no lead-in whatsoever, no opportunity to kind of take him down a road he didn't necessarily want to go. It was totally open for Moses to answer however he wanted to, and he mentioned Georgia by name there. Now, is that one of those situations where Moses should have known the powder keg was going to be opened up when he said that? I'm not really quite so sure about that, and nor am I scandalized that he said an opponent other than Clemson here. I think this is one of those things where justifiably Alabama can say, and Georgia to a degree as well, can say that when you go through the rigors of the SEC, you are going to play some tougher games and against some tougher, more physical opponents necessarily than Clemson. It's not some sort of great level of disregard to say that Clemson was not the specific word used here, toughest opponent that you played all season. That's not necessarily the case, but it does also serve as a reminder that as intense as the rivalry would seem to be between two teams that are not currently scheduled to play, Georgia and Alabama, from the UGA perspective, you've got the same thing going on with Alabama and Clemson right now as well. They are not currently on each other's schedule, but they are pretty clearly on each other's mind, whether it be passive-aggressive shots at each other at the various media days or whatever. In some form or fashion, these three teams, and maybe another fourth thrown in, they would appear to be on some kind of collision course, and I, for one, cannot wait to see how all of that plays out.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
I've got a little bit more on Alabama, the SEC Media Days, coming up in just a moment. For now, though, let's get ready to start our SEC Through by my reminder to you. You know, it wasn't all that long ago that we were at Callaway Resort and Gardens, and you know what a great time we had when we were there. Well, as much as you think about that during the summer, there's also another great thing that goes on at Callaway Resort and Gardens, and I want you to be thinking about that this time of year, because Christmas in July at Callaway means it's time to save big on the South's most magical holiday tradition. You can get your tickets for Fantasy and Lights at the biggest discount of the year. You do not want to pass this up. It's just like Christmas, because these prices are not going to last forever. They're going to be gone before you know it. So go to this website, please, CallawayGardens.com. That's CallawayGardens.com, and you can get your discounted tickets for Fantasy and Lights before it goes away and before this opportunity disappears. Make sure you take advantage of that. We loved Callaway Resort and Gardens during the summer, and certainly the Fantasy and Lights tradition is one of the great ones in the holiday season as well, so make sure you check that out, CallawayGardens.com, for a little more on that. All right, so as I said a moment ago, you can debate whether Dylan Moses had a misstep or not. The honest truth is, you know, he's asked a question, he answers it honestly. I'm never going to criticize a guy for answering a question honestly. I think that the aftermath of all of that and the criticism that comes is kind of an example of fans and media just looking for something to be, you know, kind of interested in and looking for something to make some sort of controversy about. That's just the way the college football talk here in the South goes, and by now we're all used to that. However, while I think that Moses can be defended for answering a question honestly, there was actually something that Nick Saban said yesterday that I don't think is classy at all. And I think this makes Saban look really bad, and the media will never call Saban out on this because Saban's cultivated such a cozy relationship with so many of them, but this is not a good look for a head coach. In discussing why the season ends poorly for Alabama a year ago, not winning the national championship, here's a quote from Nick Saban from SEC Media Days. He said, "We had a lot of guys who wanted to be head coaches at different places. It takes a special person to stay focused on what they have to do now when they have a job somewhere else that's awaiting them. And they have responsibility on staffs. So that's Nick Saban seemingly pointing the finger of blame. He goes on to say to SEC Media Days, I'm not being critical of those people. It's just very challenging. We've had a lot of our staff. We had a lot of that on our staff last year. I think those relationships with players go a long way to keeping players where they need to be and do the things they need to do. Continue to prepare, practice the way they need to practice so they can continue to improve and get better. We just didn't do that very well at the end of last year. To me, this looks like a really bad look for Saban, who elsewhere at SEC Media Days kind of also talked about some players thinking about leaving, going to the NFL draft. And, you know, it's almost the half kidding, half serious takeaway from all this is Saban says, I take full responsibility for what happened against Clemson, and I'm here to tell you that it was the assistant coaches and the players that I allowed to become a distraction to this team a year ago. I mean, where does Saban get off working, saying this kind of stuff? And if you're an assistant coach working your way up through your coaching ladder, is it any wonder that so few guys want to stay with Saban for a long period of time when Saban acts like it's the obligation of the other assistants that work for him to stay with him forever no matter what and add to his glory and add to his fame and never take a chance to benefit themselves professionally? And the same thing for the players who have a chance to go to the NFL draft, and maybe they don't become first-round picks, but they do go into the NFL and start earning a paycheck, something they can't do while playing for the University of Alabama. And Saban wants to say you're distracted by that. Yeah, maybe they are distracted. It's about time for some of them, I think, probably feel like they got paid here, and Saban wants to blame them. That's obviously an easy question and one to wonder, well, who is Saban talking about when he says these kinds of things? You have Mike Locksley, who left the offensive coordinator spot at Alabama a year ago to take the job at Maryland. You obviously had Dan Enos, who left in kind of a lateral move to go to Miami, maybe an example of the kind of stuff you're seeing here from Saban. Maybe not the greatest guy to work with. You also had Josh Gaddis. I heard some chatter coming out of Alabama yesterday on the radio and whatnot that they thought that Gaddis was really the one that Saban was talking to more so than any other here. You had Pete Golding, who was in the line for some jobs. He ultimately stayed at Alabama, though. This is just a weird blame game thing from Nick Saban. I talked before about how when Georgia went to SEC Media Days, I think classy is a word you could use to describe their appearance. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think this is classy at all from Saban. If Alabama fans are listening or watching right now, they're not going to like this, but I think it's just a fact. I think this kind of blame game stuff from Saban and this kind of sense of entitlement that the assistants that work with him now and the coaches that are and the players that are playing with him now are somehow supposed to be with him forever and forego their opportunities to advance themselves just to make Saban a little more successful. That's not how life works, and it's about time that Saban got a dose of reality on that. A bad look for him, and frankly, I don't really like it. Let me do two other quick stories. There was some good news for Alabama yesterday. Timothy Smith, the big defensive tackle, who we've talked about some on Before the Hedges. At one point in time, maybe a guy that you thought might be interested in Georgia. Georgia might be interested in him. Smith looks like he has committed to the University of Alabama, so they go out there and, Kirby said this past week. The thing he learned most from Nick Saban is that size matters along the line of scrimmage, and Timothy Smith, the big defensive lineman, is another example of Alabama's commitment to that. And then one more SEC story as part of our SEC Through to mention here today. So it's Gus Malzahn Day at SEC Media Days. That may even be going on now for as far as I know. Is it later on this afternoon? I'm going to be very interested to see the level of toughness in the questions for Malzahn. Of all the well-known SEC coaches, he's probably more on the hot seat this year than anybody is. There was some debate about that a year ago. A middling season against a really tough schedule. Can Malzahn survive? And how much of that gets previewed by the way that he's grilled by the media this week? That might be entertaining later on today as part of SEC Media Days, and we'll cover that tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily. And for now, we'll make that your SEC Through. And on DawgNation Daily, in the time that we have left here today, I know many of you have come used to expecting a lot of recruiting talk on the program. We missed Jeff Sintel on Tuesday for our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. We'll do that tomorrow, but his Tuesday appearance got taken away because we were at SEC Media Days this week. So I want to give you a chance to hear some recruiting stuff from him, even though you haven't heard him live on the show yet this week. We did Before the Hedges presented by Kroger yesterday, and in particular on a couple of the recruits that we talk a lot about here, all of the five-star variety. Let me first of all give you an example from Jeff on the latest when it comes to five-star cornerback Kelee Ringo. Here's what Jeff said yesterday.
Interesting. I think Ringo is going to be at Georgia for next week's visit, where the dead period is going to open for about a week. There's a cool little handy calendar on that. Kelee Ringo, it seems to me, from what the tea leaves and the inner grapevine that I hear tells me, is that he might make his eventual decision at an All-American game.
I take two things from that. First of all, set your calendars to look ahead to next weekend. It sounds like that's going to be a gigantic recruiting event for Georgia. If names like Ringo are in the mix, you better believe that's something we're going to be talking about a lot here. And speaking of Ringo, my other takeaway from that quote from Jeff Sintel is it sounds like we're going to be waiting a while to find out the ultimate news on Ringo, whether he visits next week to Georgia or not. How about the latest on five-star running back Kendall Milton? Here's what Jeff said about that yesterday.
July 29th, that's the decision finish line for Kendall Milton. He's told us that he doesn't plan to take any more visits after that. Reminder, folks, he will enroll early at one of those 4 schools. And I think it's going to be a big day on July 29th. There's already a ceremony coming together, I've been told. And if we could ever, show more production value on our top targets, gotta get guys list, I would put an up arrow next to Kendall Milton, because that 4.60 he clocked at 2:29 at the opening finals out in Texas, to me, gooses him ever closer to Kelee Ringo on that top targets.
So some words of compliments there for Kendall Milton. Also July 29th, a big date to consider, as that's the date that Jeff Sintel says that Kendall Milton, one way or another, is going to make it official with his school of choice. One more update here, another five-star, but the five-star defensive lineman Jordan Birch. Here's Jeff on him yesterday.
With Jordan Birch, I think this is going to go a long way. I don't think this young man is anywhere close to making his decision. And he's absolutely, positively likely not to do any more media at all regarding his decision. He's very close to the vest with all of his information. He's very close to the vest with his family. But I want to share one thing that will make folks, maybe even my guy here, Brandon, a little bit worried. I don't know how many people know this, but Jordan Birch goes to the Hammond School. That's in Columbia, South Carolina. Already a backyard advantage for the Gamecocks. His teammate Alex Huntley is already committed to play defensive line for the Gamecocks as well. I'm going to go one further for you out there, brother. Will Muschamp's son is the quarterback for the Hammond School. You know what that means with the grateful and kind rules of the NCAA? He can go visit Hammond anytime he wants. Any Friday night, any practice, any two-a-day, any fall camp. You know why? Because his son's on that team.
So good stuff there from Jeff Sintel on Jordan Birch and others. And as Chris Branham and Leon Hutchinson and a few others point out in our Facebook comments section, it's also Jeff's birthday. So happy birthday to Jeff Sintel. We appreciate you providing such recruiting information to us like that. And we hope you enjoy your special day, Jeff, if you happen to be watching right now. Happy birthday to all of you, and I'm sure all of our audience will join me in saying that. As far as the situation with Birch goes, we have talked on this show about that Columbia connection, the fact that he does go to the same school that Muschamp's son goes to. And one thing I've said before, and this is just my opinion, and maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't, but the silence from Birch, I think, is maybe a good sign for Georgia or potentially Clemson. That if you're going to stay in town and go to the University of South Carolina, you're likely very noisy and loud about that. So the longer this stays quiet, the more I think Georgia's got a chance, but we shall see. How about our Gator Hater Updater? 992 days. That number continues to climb. We'll see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily. And on video, a lot in the show today. Paul Feinbaum hearing from some Georgia players, some thoughts on where the SEC is at the moment. Hope you enjoyed it all. Robert Lee Clearly Jr. saying happy birthday, Jeff Sintel. Paul Amerson as well. I'm sure Jeff is very happy to receive those birthday wishes. And we will kind of get into anything you want to discuss here for a couple of moments, kind of open-ended with your thoughts. And we have to jump off the air here in a little bit, take care of some business, but we'll certainly go as many comments as we can. As we do so, I'll remind you of my friends at R.S. Andrews. They bring the R.S. Andrews School down to you every single day. And the other thing they can bring to you is that $99 Smiley tune-up for your air conditioning unit. You may say, well, why do they call it a Smiley tune-up? Because R.S. Andrews has been in business for a long time, and story after story, they deliver smiles. But let's face it, we all have a story one way or another about inviting someone into our home to fix something that's broken, and for a lot of people, those stories aren't good. I can tell you about a lot of different kinds of things that I've had worked on by supposedly trained and expert techs And when they got to my house, the story that I was left with was not a great one. Certainly no smile on my face about that. Well, R.S. Andrews over the years has heard those stories too, and they want to make sure they're a different kind of company. And they do business a different kind of way. And what is a more important thing to have that kind of commitment to than when it comes to your air conditioning? We've got a heat wave rolling through, not just here in the South, but really all across the country right now. Temperature is going to be hotter over the next couple of days than they've been all summer long. You want your air conditioning to work, and if yours is not, well, R.S. Andrews can put a smile back on your face with that $99 Smiley tune-up as they get your system back to factory fresh specs. So check them out online at rsandrews.com. The website, once again, rsandrews.com. Tim Ruff says, for 1,000 days, BA, you should eat some fried gator tail on the show. So when we did one of our events at Marlowe's Tavern last fall, the chef there at the North Lake location, I believe we were at, the chef there over in Tucker was nice enough to, this is one of the cool things about Marlowe's Tavern is they have some special things at the various taverns in whatever neighborhood you happen to be in, where the chefs have a lot of control over the kinds of food they want to cook. And so he knew that I was obviously a big gator hater, so he made specially that night some fried gator tail. I'd tell you something. He kind of fried them up like nuggets, basically, and you kind of popped them like a chicken nugget. I can tell you something. That's really good. It was very tender meat, so I really, really enjoyed that for sure. Randy Hall says, get Tyndall on Birch. Yeah, that's an example of a win that Georgia's gotten in recruiting in Columbia, South Carolina. And if Georgia can do that with Channing Tyndall before, no reason to think that it couldn't do that with Jordan Birch right now. Although, in fairness to South Carolina, the one position group where they've had a good bit of success, including some head-to-head wins against Georgia, and Kirby Smart even acknowledged that this week at SEC Media Days. They've gone head-to-head and won for some defensive linemen. A big win for Zach Pickens a year ago. Go back and look at Rick Sandage for the class of 2018. It's an example of South Carolina being able to get in on some of those defensive linemen. I think Birch would be a really big get for Georgia and go a long way towards answering what has not been a position group that Georgia has recruited quite as high and as to an elite level as it has everything else. And so I think that's one to watch, but I'm not going to discount Georgia's ability to do that in Columbia because of what it did with Channing Tyndall. I think the commenter brings up a really good point on that. Zenti Zelo Allen says, our wide receiver stats don't tell the full story. We're literally a 70% run, 30% pass offense. That's not enough touches for, let me get the rest of this from Zelo. He says, oh, come on. Dadgummit. Sorry. Good gracious alive. My whole computer's falling apart. All right. Well, now I can't see any comments at all. So Zelo says that the wide receivers need more touches to get more stats. I think that's probably true to a certain extent. I guess what I'm hoping for here is, not just why are my comments just completely gone away. For me, this is not just about there we go. Now I'm back. To me, this is not just about throwing the ball more. It's throwing the ball for more big plays. And here's what you hope for, as you said, kind of loosely speaking, a 70% run team with really big offensive line and really good running backs. You hope that there's an opportunity, whether it be play action pass or just the defense's need to key on the run, bringing safeties closer to the line of scrimmage. You hope that there's an opportunity for more big plays, because that's really what I want to see from Georgia. I don't want to see all that many more total throws per game. I think that does get Georgia away from what it has done to make itself great. The offense the last couple of years has been near the top of the country in terms of overall production, but the one thing I'd like to see sprinkled into that is a few more times a game, like 3 or 4 more times a game is what I've been saying, where Georgia goes for the big home run ball, and hopefully the collection of receivers on this year's team has the ability to create the kinds of separation that makes that possible. That's really the thing that's been missing from Georgia, are those big, dynamic, deep passing plays that break the back of a defense and completely change the tone of an offensive possession. I'd love to see Georgia add that. You can beat the Kentuckys, the South Carolinas, the Tennessees of the world without it. But when you play an Alabama in December or an LSU in December or a Clemson, Ohio State, Oklahoma in the college football playoff, you need that extra dimension, and that's when I hope to see that show up. I think it's a really good point. Jonathan Searcy says, I've always heard that Fromm doesn't have a big arm, but he can still sling it. My feeling about arm strength is essentially my same feeling about really high top-end speed. If you can run a 4.3 40, that's great, but there aren't that many times in a football game where you are in an all-out sprint. There are a few times, but for the most part, you are running less than 100% most of the time. The same thing's true with throwing the football as well. Your overall arm strength, as measured by how hard you throw it or how far you throw it, there aren't that many times in a game when you're asked to max out at 100%. For the most part, you're throwing at something less than 100% for virtually every throw. And so ultimately, if Fromm throws it as hard or as far as another quarterback by comparison, that ultimately does not matter all that much, especially when Fromm justifiably can say, while I may be, less from an arm strength standpoint measurably than some of the other top quarterbacks in college football, there are a few quarterbacks who are going to be more accurate than me. And if you gave me the choice between the strongest arm or the more accurate quarterback, I think you've got the evidence on your side to say it's the more accurate quarterback who you're ultimately going to have more success with. Now ultimately, you want accuracy on deep throws, big throws that are thrown accurately into tight windows. That's really the best of the best. But given what Fromm does well in comparison to what another quarterback might do better than him, I just think it happens to be the case that Fromm's skill set is more conducive to success. So, yeah, Fromm does not have the strongest arm in college football. He didn't have the strongest arm in the Georgia roster a year ago. But the things that Fromm did do well made him the right choice to be Georgia's starting quarterback, and that's the reason why he's in every conversation you want to have this season for the NFL draft, for the Heisman Trophy, and for everything else. Let me go over to YouTube for a moment, then I'll come back to Facebook here in just a bit. Huck Finn, who's typically one of our trolls over here on YouTube, says Dan Mullen will be this year's Coach of the Year. Congratulations to him on that. Grun D says BA only gives excuses about Fromm. That's not the case. I'm the one that asked Fromm directly about what Georgia's going to need to do better in some of these hostile road environments. Those are two games which Fromm has not played well in. I'm the one that pointed that out this week at SEC Media Day. So I'm more than happy to talk to you about what I still want to see from Fromm. We just did that 10 minutes ago or 5 minutes ago, however long it was, about more big throws deep down the field. Some of that's on the Georgia play calling. Some of that's on the Georgia wide receivers. Some of that's also on Fromm. So if you want to have a conversation about what Fromm still needs to improve on, I'm happy to do it. But if that's the only thing you want to talk about, well, at a certain point, I'm going to get tired about that, and I'm going to also move on to the things that Fromm does really well. This is one of those examples in life where more than one thing can be true at the same time, and a variety of opinions are valid on Fromm. Yes, there are some things that he's still working upon and improving. We talked to Trent Dilfer about that back in January or February, whatever month it was. And simultaneously, there's the overwhelming number of things that Fromm does really well. The people who have looked at him and say that he's among the best quarterbacks in college football, they are not all doing that because they're cheering for him or rooting for him, which is the kind of thing I think sometimes people within the Georgia bubble get accused of. So I'm more than happy to talk about the full and complete picture of Fromm, the areas in which he still needs to improve, and the overwhelming number of areas in which he's already a top-flight signal caller. Huck Finn says, I've already done Huck Finn before. I was going to see Enrique Murillo back in the comment section for the first time in a while. He says there's a lot of Bama trolls in the comment section today. Yeah, the show is always going to attract a lot of attention from folks outside the bubble. That's always going to be the case because there's just not a lot of people who do what we do every single day. RT367 says, BA, who do you see as the starting wide receivers? Les Simmons and D-Rob. So it sounds like RT thinks that Tyler Simmons and Demetrius Robertson are givens there, which is kind of an interesting thing to say. If there was no Dominic Blaylock and George Pickens, I think that would definitely be true. Had Robertson not been sick on G-Day, he was likely going to be your starting slot receiver. He would have probably been that guy there in that spot. And I think you're probably accurate to say that Simmons, given his experience, is a guy who has an inside track into being one of the starters on the outside. It's also worth pointing out that in the clip I played earlier, I believe the only receiver that Fromm mentioned by name was Simmons, so take that for what it's worth. So if we stipulate your two names, that leaves you 2 left. And I think between Cager and Pickens, one of those 2 newcomers, they would likely line up at the other spot on the outside. But Demetrius Robertson holding off Dominic Blaylock for that majority role as the inside slot guy. I wonder if he's going to be able to do that. I do. The one thing that I think Robertson probably has over Blaylock is that blazing speed, and that's the kind of thing that you're going to want to find a way to utilize Robertson on. But the other part of this, though, is that Blaylock may have less overall top-end speed, but maybe a higher rating and a lot of other aspects, including the physicality part of this. The ability to go catch the football over the middle is the kind of thing that I don't think that Blaylock's going to shy away from whatsoever. And I hope Georgia does use the deep middle portion of the field a bit more this year. That ends up being an interesting competition. Don't be so quick to assume that Robertson, because he's been here, necessarily takes that opportunity away from Dominic Blaylock. And conversely, I guess, let's not also be so quick to assume that just because Robertson didn't play last year that he's not in the mix for playing time this year. I think that's going to be a fun competition to watch for sure. And RT, I'm glad you brought up the topic here. Deloach Approach on YouTube says many seem to overlook Blaylock. He's going to show them when he plays with that Mount Everest-sized chip on his shoulder. I think that's an interesting way to describe Dominic Blaylock. Does he have a chip on his shoulder about not being a 5-star and not being as talked about as, say, Jaden Hazelwood would have been, and maybe as talked about even as George Pickens is on this Georgia roster right now, although I would say that Blaylock gets at least as much attention as Pickens has got. Does he have a chip on his shoulder about maybe not being the most highly rated recruit? Connor, how would you say that as Connor Raleigh gets ready to join us?
We have a video story, something in the works regarding Dominic Blaylock coming down the pipe, and we were sort of asked, Jeff had asked him, how do you feel about being, somewhat slept on, under discussed, given sort of the talent that he's always had. He was offered by Georgia as an 8th grader. So he's always been like a name to know, and was a 5-star for literally the entire 2019 recruiting cycle until the final rankings when he just missed it. Long story short, Blaylock flatly said no, like he doesn't really care all that much that he's quote unquote slept on or overlooked. He's really, and this is I think a big reason why I am as fond of him as I am. He's just very I just want to go out and play football. I think with the All-American game, a lot of guys maybe don't try and go out and do a whole lot in that game. Blaylock had 3 touchdowns in that game.
He threw one of them.
Yesterday on the YouTube question, a couple of people were asking about, is there anyone who could sort of fill that wild dog role with regards to James Cook? I think Blaylock could do that, given that, watching him a little bit last year at Walton High School in Marietta.
Played that position a lot.
He did that a lot, and I believe there was a game against North Gwinnett where Walton's starting quarterback went down, and there were long stretches of that game where they were just, all right, Dom, you're going to play quarterback, you're going to take the ball, and you're just going to figure out what to do with it. And, he had 10 rushing touchdowns a year ago.
He does that thing that coaches try to teach, but some athletes just not capable of doing, where you put your toe in the turf and make that cut and go. Mm-hmm. Blaylock was really good at that as a Wildcat quarterback last year, or I guess a Wild Raider quarterback.
I think all Raiders are wild.
Yeah, in the Walton offense, you'd have to say that. I think that's a pretty interesting thing to bring up. Hasheem Spikes had a comment I wanted to get to. Oh, it was about Demetrius Robertson being used like Eli Stove has been used at Auburn, and this came up the other day when we talked about James Cook a bit too. That when you start talking about these guys who have unique skill sets, they're going to require creativity for Georgia to use them well. I hope Georgia takes that extra step to be creative here, because ultimately how you use a unique guy like Robertson who's blazing fast but maybe not quite as big as you want some people to be, or how you use a guy like James Cook who's more of an all-purpose type back. Oh, in the NFL, you'd think of him as a 3rd down back, I think. How you use guys like that, I think also shows a guy like a Rick Gilbert that your unique skill set, being big and being a guy that has a nose for the football, we can use you too. We can treat you different than a typical tight end. We can do something unique with you. I have to say, as someone who certainly hopes the answer to this question is yes, it is still an unknown for me whether Georgia wants to be unique offensively. Does it want to be creative with how it uses its unusual weapons? As it stands right now, to be kind, the answer is to be determined. But if you're forced to say yes or no, so far, the answer is no. Georgia does not want to do that because it hasn't done that very effectively thus far.
Sorry, I was scrolling through comments.
Would you agree with me, though, that if you're forced to say, based on the last 2 years, does Georgia want to be creative and use unique offensive weapons? Based on 2 years' worth of evidence, they don't want to.
No, they don't.
And I hope it changes. I hope it changes this year.
Right.
But fair is fair. They haven't done that.
We had a long discussion about James Coley yesterday and sort of Kirby Smart's involvement in the offense. And, I mean, we have the clips to prove it. There were times last year where Smart got incredibly frustrated with Chaney and sort of that execution in the red zone. So I do wonder if maybe because of some of those frustrations a year ago, Kirby is more willing to be hands-off on the offensive side and sort of let James Coley run the offense that he would like to run.
Brian McPhail on a different topic has a really good question, and this is going to come up a lot as we head towards the start of the season. He says, when does Stetson Bennett play against Vanderbilt? And in this particular conversation, it still seems like Dwan Mathis is a little ways away from being kind of a full go to play football, so he may not be a competitor for the backup quarterback job at the very beginning of the season, which might put him behind all year long. But for now, it would look like Stetson Bennett, who I thought was the favorite to win that job anyway. It looks like the backup quarterback job is going to go to Bennett because of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding Mathis and the surgery that he had a couple of months ago. So what Brian McPhail says is, when does he play against Vandy? In the fourth quarter. And I think, for a Georgia team that may not want to show all of its tricks on the road week one against Vanderbilt, given what it has to come later on in the season, if there was ever a motivation to be up big enough where you felt comfortable playing a guy who hasn't played in a true SEC game yet, getting Bennett some action on the road. I might even put him in a 17-point game, something like that, something that feels still a little, feels at least a little close enough that the Vanderbilt fans are still kind of into the game a little bit. I wouldn't mind seeing Georgia do that just a little bit.
So if you wind the clock back a year, Georgia's first SEC game a year ago was on the road. Georgia was at South Carolina.
Yeah.
A lot of people were wondering, when do you put Justin Fields in? A lot of people, for obviously different reasons than Stetson Bennett, but still a lot of people were wondering when is he going to enter the game. Fields didn't enter that game until there were about 9 minutes left, and Georgia was pretty clearly going to win that game by a very comfortable margin.
And he wasn't happy about that.
And there's
yeah.
video proof that he was not happy about that. I think around that 9-minute mark in the fourth quarter, when Georgia's up by 4 touchdowns, is when Bennett's going to enter this game.
I think you're probably right, but I think fair or not, they're going to treat Bennett differently than they treated Justin Fields. Had they played Fields early in that game against South Carolina last year, it would have been some sort of message to fans about their potential plans for Fields, or it would have maybe been a message to him that here's how much we believe in you. We're going to give you early playing time on the road in an SEC game. The fact that they waited to do that, I think, was Kirby Smart's way of sending the opposite message to the observers of the game and to Fields in particular. For Bennett this year, who is a true backup, and I think even he knows that he's the true backup, I think you could potentially be a bit more lenient with him if you wanted to be, because I don't think you send any kind of message by putting Bennett into a game. Now, I don't believe they're going to get too aggressive with how they put him in. They're not going to put him in the second quarter, for instance. I don't think they'll do that. But, if it's an empty stadium when you put Bennett into the game, you might miss him.
I think you're overthinking this. I think when they put Bennett into the game, Jake Fromm is not coming back into the game. His day.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But, you might be missing an the thing that Bennett will learn how to do, he already knows how to do. He knows how to run the offense. So you play him against Murray State, he's not really getting that much more experience than what he's gotten before. But when you face a crowd that's kind of, or a TV audience, things like that, that's really the experience that Stetson Bennett can get. So I hope against Vanderbilt, Georgia's up enough that it feels comfortable to play him more rather than less, because that's your last real opportunity to give him something that feels like a real game before you get to the actual real games that come week after week once you get to week 4 and Notre Dame rolls around.
I think backup quarterbacks are a lot like Schrodinger's cat. You never know what is exactly in the box and whether or not the cat's alive until you open it, and by that point, kind of think, oh, this isn't going to end out well. I think it's better that we don't actually ever know how good Stetson Bennett is.
But just based on the last 5 years of evidence, backup quarterbacks have been a pretty significant story in college football, especially at the high end. Clemson's backup quarterback was a story last year in its pursuit of a national championship. You can cite Alabama. Georgia's backup quarterback led them to a college football playoff in 2017. Ohio State's backup quarterback, third string, won a national championship for them in 2014. So I'm right there with the fan who says, I hope we don't find out anything about Georgia's backup quarterback. There's at least a little bit of evidence over the last few years that for national championship teams, one way or another, we end up talking about their backup quarterback. Mike Anderson says Stetson will hand off the ball, maybe throw against the two cupcake teams. That's probably the more likely answer there. But I kind of agree with Brian McPhail that if you can find a way to get him involved in that Vanderbilt game, you give him something that he really can't get in any other opportunity. I think at Vanderbilt week 1, not as exciting as some of the week 1 teams that other opponents are going to play. I think it's a good chance for Georgia to get a much better version of a dress rehearsal than, say, Murray State is at home, where you really, in some respects, don't learn anything about anything. Even though Georgia's going to be, more than a 3-touchdown favorite in that game in all likelihood, you can still learn something. You can, Vanderbilt is not a team incapable of doing some stuff. And one of the things you might be able to learn is a little something about your backup quarterback. I don't think that's a bad point. Gary and Christian Gulisano on a slightly different point says, what about Kyrus Jackson? Seems like we don't hear a thing about him or out of him. And he obviously was thrust into a slightly bigger role on G-Day when Demetrius Robertson didn't play. I feel comfortable right now, though, saying that if I had to make my wager, I would put a little bit of money on D-Rob and a little bit of money on Dominic Blaylock as being the guys to emerge in that slot receiver role before I would get to Kyrus Jackson. Now, you got to pick somebody, and those are my picks. That doesn't mean that Kyrus Jackson doesn't have a chance. But as it stands right now, I would put Robertson and Blaylock ahead of him. And obviously, Kyrus, who comes from a really good football program down in Peach County, who's used to competing, he'll have to compete and do something about that. But this is, to me, more of a numbers game than is an indictment against Kyrus Jackson. But I do have Robertson and Blaylock ahead of him at the moment.
As birthday boy Jeff Sintel would say, just don't forget about him. Don't be surprised if he comes out and makes plays. And again, the beginning of spring, Kirby Smart, was pretty vocal that he wanted to see something out of Kyrus Jackson. Now, I think we can say that maybe we didn't necessarily see that this spring, but, there's probably a reason Kirby had expectations for Kyrus Jackson to do something this spring, and I would like to think that, Kyrus could possibly follow through on that and earn some significant playing time ahead of guys who were rated as higher and better recruits.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's certainly a possibility, but at some point in time, you got to take a stand one way or another. And I'm going to go Robertson Blaylock right now over Jackson, but he is definitely in the category of a guy you don't want to count out. Derek Green says, who is our playmaker on defense? And I think playmaker is an interesting word because playmaker does kind of factor into that havoc discussion that's been ongoing, tackles for loss and sacks and passes broken up and interceptions. Those are the kinds of plays that you think of a playmaker making on defense. So all told, who is most likely to make the most of those this season? I would say I'm going to go back to a name that, and this is more in the don't count him out category than it is emphatically saying he's going to do it, but I'm going to tout once again a guy that I've been touting lately. I'm going to say don't count out Richard LeCounte being a big-time playmaker for this Georgia defense this year, both because he has a little bit of a nose for the football and because he has vouched as much as anyone for the weight that he's put on and the technique that he's tried to enhance to go out there and be what he said he needed to be, which is a better tackler. In terms of being a playmaker, now obviously the young guys like Nolan and N'Kobe and all of them are going to get their say on this too. I'm going to throw a few chips down on Richard LeCounte here to also be a big-time playmaker there, which is maybe slightly at odds with what some Georgia fans would expect. But give me a little bit of Richard LeCounte on that. Amos Williams also mentions Tyler Clark, which is an interesting answer as well.
I think it's going to be hard for Clark to really be, the sort of disruptive playmaker you need to be from the defensive tackle position. Those guys are pretty rare. Quinn and Williams is sort of a one-of-his-kind type, which he was for Alabama last year. My answer for this is going to be when you factor in the run and the pass, I'm going to go with Azeez Ojulari.
Interesting name.
A guy Jeff is pretty high on. A guy, popular forum user, South Florida Dog, is pretty high on. A guy myself I'm pretty high on. I think is a guy when you factor in the contributions he's going to be able to make in the run and in the past, because I think, I'm not sure how much Nolan is going to get on the field on early downs, just, as he adjusts to the college game. I think when you factor all that in, I think Ojulari can sort of play that DeAndre, maybe not be as good as DeAndre Walker was a year ago, but sort of be in that same sort of mold for the Bulldogs this year.
Amos Williams kind of comes back at me and says, LeCount can't tackle BA. Here's the point that I've made about LeCount, though. I think some of his missed tackles were so high profile in nature, they end up making us feel that he's a worse tackler than he really is. Now, Amos LeCount himself has admitted that that's an area in which he wants to improve his game. But some of his misses either showed up on the TV screen so prominently or they're obviously noticeable in the stadium that it leads you to believe that it leads you to believe that a guy is worse than he really is. There was a book about this not too long, it's been a long time ago now, where what was it? Was it Jeff Duncan? I know he's the lieutenant governor, but was he also the one that was the pitching coach for Tony La Russa when he was the manager of the A's back in the 80s? He talked about how, if a guy comes up and he pulls 2 balls really hard on you down the line, you think of him as a pull hitter. But if the next 8 or 9 balls are kind of sprayed all over the rest of the field, that's really the more accurate representation of what a player does. And I think LeCount's kind of the same way there, that, you see the missed tackles and therefore you think he's a missed tackler. But Pro Football Focus and others tabulate every play. And they're going to tell you that on the preponderance of evidence, the rest of the game, besides the one really bad miss, LeCount was apparently doing a lot better than some of us maybe noticed by watching on TV or in the stadium when our eyes were on somebody else. Scott Harris says, how do you improve in the red zone this year? Play calls or just brute force? Scott, to me, it's way more about play calling than it is about brute force, because I think Georgia tried the brute force a year ago, and that's the thing that didn't really work. And it is in the creativity of what you do during the goal line that I think matters more than anything else. And I talked to J.R. Reed about that in particular during SEC Media Days on Tuesday, when he, in the midst of answering a question, said they had some specific goals they were trying to reach this year. And I followed up by saying, would you mind telling us what some of those goals are? And one of the things that he did mention was the goal line stuff. To me, it's not – he mentioned red zone. I think red zone's kind of an arbitrary number. For me, it's really more about what you do inside the 10-yard line or down near the goal line. Those are the issues, closer than just the 20, 10 and in, where Georgia had its real problems. And it sounds like Georgia is identifying that as an issue to be corrected. And for me, I think if you're going to give me the choice of is it brute force or is it creative play calling, I think 95% of this at least is how creatively you call plays down there. Because the one thing I've learned from, I guess, kind of watching the game more that I didn't really always appreciate, especially when you see a game from the field, this to me becomes a little more obvious. It's just harder to call plays down near the goal line because you've got less field to work with. And I used to think when so-and-so team was bad in the red zone, that was just kind of a random, meaningless occurrence that, it just so happened to be the case, not necessarily some greater meaning to that. But when you see how the field looks different in short yardage situations where safeties aren't asked to worry about what's going to happen over their head, all of a sudden you realize, wow, it takes a different brand of play calling to succeed in this situation. You better be able to use the middle part of the field. You better be able to use short passing to your advantage. You better be able to survey a lot of different options. You better be able to use space to create opportunities for running backs, because brute force in and of itself doesn't work, because the defense for the first time has a little bit of a, if it's not a mathematical advantage, they can at least make it mathematically a fair fight, which for the other 80 yards typically kind of isn't the case.
Yeah. And with regards to more creative play calling, one of the things I picked up this week, Kirby Smart sort of touched on, Georgia's offensive line and this idea that, because they're just so big and so mammoth, they're just going to push you 5 yards into the end zone. That's not realistic and not the case. They're more sort of described as like a tree that's like leaning, and it just leans on you and leans on you and leans on you, and then eventually you just fall over because you can't stay up under the support of the tree leaning on you for so long. That's sort of what Georgia's offensive line likes to play like. They're not going to come out and hit you right in the mouth and knock you out in the first quarter. They're going to sort of just bury you slowly, and then the third, fourth quarter of the games, you give out and, just fall under the pressure. I think you saw that against Florida and Kentucky.
I think that's a really good point. And you see this against non-SEC teams probably even more prominently. Look at the way that Georgia kind of wears Oklahoma down over the course of a Rose Bowl. And I think back to like an LSU Texas Tech bowl game a couple years ago where, Texas Tech's getting its shots and doing its stuff and moving down the field. But over the course of a full game, the size of a defensive line or an offensive line becomes hard to deal with. I think the point that Connor's making is a good one, which is big offensive line is not necessarily going to blow you into the stands on one play, but over the course of a game, that size is just a really hard thing to deal with, and I think that's probably true.
Right, because, as much as Florida fans love to talk about that goal line stand or whatever, and admittedly it's a black eye for Georgia last year, that fourth quarter, they were busting off big plays left and right because that Florida defensive line just could not hold up against Georgia's offensive line in the aggregate. So while Florida can celebrate their goal line stand, Georgia celebrates the win.
Adrian Carver, yeah, it's true. Adrian Carver says, hate to invoke Rick's name here, but his use of the fullback inside the 10-yard line, let me get the rest of Adrian's comment, basically going on to say, was a thing of beauty, either as an additional blocking back or a great pass option for the screen. Why does my comments keep disappearing? Basically loving the idea of that fullback inside there. And I think that's true as well. There's been a lot said about the disappearance of the fullback from college football in particular, NFL to a certain extent also, where the one back set has kind of become at least the majority of snaps, I would say. I think there still should be a role for fullbacks, and it's not as this, just ram back, powering, blocker lining up right behind the quarterback. As Adrian pointed out, it's really an opportunity for creativity. You can throw two fullbacks, but the defenses need to at least think about what that other offensive player is doing right behind the quarterback. Also opens up other opportunities for the passing game as well. Look at a team like New England that has put two backs on the field a lot, and one of the things that has made that offense tough to stop is when they throw out of a set that would typically look like a running set, all of a sudden they're throwing out of that because the defense has now created a situation where there's a numerical mismatch to go for the passing play. That's what creative offenses do, and as we said before, I think there's some pressure on Kirby and the Georgia offense this year led by James Coley to be creative. Thus far, Georgia's been content to stay with its power advantage, but man, I think the next step for Georgia means a little more creativity. I do.
You bring up the Patriots, best team in all of football, pro and college. They use a fullback plenty.
Yeah.
Granted they have Tom Brady playing quarterback, but they're not afraid to sort of lean on those guys where everyone else seems to be zigging. They're sort of zagging.
Hashim Spike says it may be time to upgrade the laptop, BA. So here's the truth. This is kind of a new laptop I've been using lately. I gave my wife my other one, so I think it's one of the. Pardon me?
I was just making a Borat joke.
Oh, I think that it's just more of an issue of having to get used to something I'm not all that used to using.
It's like driving a new car, It's you've had your old car for so long, you just got to make some small adjustments and changes to it.
Yeah, you don't know where the blinker is and things along those lines. Let me see if there's anything other than just absolute anarchy in the YouTube comment section. For the most part, there is not. I'm glad some of these people have such a good time, though. I'm glad. Cameron Camp says the chat's more enjoyable when you block all the trolls. Yeah, I don't block anybody unless they say something offensive. But for those of you, who are not enjoying some of the YouTube stuff, my invitation would be to block as many people as you want here. And I don't mind non-Georgia fans participating in the conversation. I don't mind that at all. But when it's an attempt to draw the conversation away from what everybody else wants to talk about, then I do think it hurts the enjoyment of other people. So for now, let me just go back over to Facebook. I can't really find anything on the YouTube side of things worth reading right now. Matt Rugavina says, Crow King, get it together. So, yes, we have a Facebooker calling out a YouTuber for.
Oh, no.
Yeah, listen.
The warring tribes are at it again.
John Chappell says, BA is a true Southern and blinker instead of turn signal. Yeah, I don't probably say turn signal very much. I probably don't say that. I say all kinds of those sort of Southern words that you don't really hear anywhere else. I'm probably a very, very legit Southerner when it comes to that. We're going to get ready to get off the air here anyway in just a second. Boy, it's later than I intended for it to be. Connor, you have anything else you want to say today before we go?
No, not particularly. I'm going to be out Friday and Monday going on a quick little vacation.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow, good for you.
Yeah, I'll be enjoying the West Coast, so we're going to San Francisco for a few
I do remember you saying that the other day. A lot of vacations.
I have a question for you. Okay. It's not football.
All right.
You're going to take your kids to go see the new Lion King movie?
I don't know. I have heard some not great things about it. I like The Lion King. I think it's a really cool movie. It sounds like, though, that what they call, I guess, the photorealistic animation, it sounds like that's not working for everybody. I think my daughter is 4, and my son's only 7. So when, spoiler alert, Mufasa dies, that's already scary enough in like cartoon animation.
Yeah.
I'm afraid for something that looks like a real animal, I'm afraid they wouldn't like that part very much. I'm afraid that the realistic animation for my very young kids might I'm afraid they might not enjoy it. I really like The Lion King. I'd love to share that with them in a theater, but I'm afraid they might not like it. It may be too scary for them. Daughter especially.
2 things. One, the new Lion King movie is half an hour longer than the original.
Is that right?
So I'll be interested to see how they do that. 2, I mean, the original Lion King, in my opinion, is the best Disney movie of all time. So it's hard to remake a classic and
I think it's a really great movie.
Yeah, like as much as I'd love to see John Oliver as Zazu or Seth Rogen as Pumbaa,
Wait, is it John Oliver that's playing?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Zod. Not. Is it?
You're thinking of Rafiki.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about.
Donald Glover is playing Simba.
Yeah.
Beyonce is playing Nala.
Yeah.
James Earl Jones is back as Mufasa.
He is.
So
also reprised his role as Darth Vader back during Rogue One as well. So he's kind of been around there. For a while.
And like the songs are just the songs are great in the original and they're just as good in the new one. I've sort of listened to both a lot recently, so. I still think there's a good chance I might just go watch the original again this weekend.
That's actually a good point. I kind of want to see it myself, just because I'm curious about just how different it looks. I think the opening sequence with the Circle of Life would probably be really cool to see in the photorealistic style,
Mm-hmm.
but in the other stuff, I don't know that my kids are going to like it quite as much. We also haven't seen Toy Story 4 yet either, and they're Toy Story fans. We just haven't gotten out to see Toy Story 4 yet either, so...
I have a take on Circle of Life. I think it's a wildly overrated Lion King song. Like,
is that right?
It's one of my least favorite ones.
I kind of like it, I have to say.
I mean, like, the opening is iconic, but the song itself does not hold up. And I was told pretty repeatedly yesterday, you're nuts for thinking that.
No, I do like Circle of Life. I have to say, I really do.
Hakuna Matata is the best song, though.
I don't mind that one either. I don't mind that either. Mike D says, don't ruin your childhood by watching it. It's a waste of time and money. So here's the thing for me on stuff like this. I can watch something like this and say it's not as good as the original, and it does not make me mad at Disney for trying, if that makes sense. And I'm right there with so many of you who say a lot of these remakes don't really have a right to exist. I'm right there with you on that. But I don't mind you trying, I guess, because in some respects, maybe a remake one day might be, something that stands right there alongside its predecessor. So in this case, I'm kind of like Connor, that the fact they're remaking the movie again makes me want to go back and just watch the original. And I wish some of these Disney movies were a little bit easier to go back and access. Some of the stuff is just expensive. But yeah, I am a very, very big fan of the original. 1994 was one of those seminal years. I was a junior in high school. And so, a movie like that coming out then was just a very big part of, even though I'm a little older then than the target audience of the movie probably would have been. But in 1994, that movie was just everywhere.
Yep.
It was just everywhere.
1994, a great year for movies.
It was a really good year for movies.
Lion King. I mean, Forrest Gump is okay, but some people really enjoy it. Pulp Fiction, Shawshank Redemption, just a loaded year for movies.
Yeah, it was a really good year for movies. All right, let me do this before we get out of here. Green Soldier says, and it's always great to have him on the show, that he was on the plane ride home from deployment. Green, we certainly welcome you back to stateside here. He says, what is the biggest takeaway from SEC Media Day? So I'll give my 2 or 3 here in no particular order. I'll let Connor do the same thing. And if some of y'all want to weigh in, we'll go off the air on this note. I think, and I mentioned this before, I think one of the more significant developments league-wide is Saban playing the blame game for losing to Clemson last year. I think it's a bad look for Saban. I think it makes him seem even harder to work with, that he doesn't celebrate the professional accomplishments and the opportunity to advance themselves for his assistants. It makes Saban look like the person many of us already thought that he was. So from a league-wide standpoint, I think that's kind of interesting. From a Georgia standpoint, Green, I think the thing that I take away from their appearance, and I think that you would be glad to hear about this as a Georgia fan, they are taking head-on their responsibility to go out and, as they say, do more and win a national championship this year. There would be a way to talk about this in other forms and fashion. You could shy away from those expectations if you wanted to, and Georgia doesn't want to. So when I think about the one-sentence headline for Georgia, as quietly confident as they can be, they believe that they can and should win a national championship. And I think for Georgia fans, that ought to be a sense of pride. Connor, how about you, league-wide and from Georgia thus far?
League-wide, I go back to Saban. I was really kind of stunned that he took a shot at his assistants yesterday and the players and saying he wasn't, they weren't focused for that game. I mean, I don't know how you don't get focused for a game like that. And, the fact that he's still sort of, bringing this up, 8 months after the fact, it is a little odd. We saw Jeremy Pruitt do all he could to not talk about his team, filibustering for 21 minutes. So you have to think if Jeremy Pruitt can do it, Saban can certainly do something at that level. As far as Georgia, I think Tuesday when they spoke really hammered home to me the idea that this is a championship or bust season from their perspective. That's the way they are looking at this. Jerry Reed in the TV room, he was asked, how do you guys think about Alabama? Would you like another chance at them? Completely sidestepped that notion at all and said, I want to get to an SEC championship and win that. I want to get back to a national championship game and win that. And I think they've made it very clear those are their explicit goals this year.
And by the way, from a practical standpoint, that also serves the purpose of actually being true, because Alabama's path through the SEC West is, based on what Alabama is compared to who it's competing with, just as hard, if not more difficult, than what Georgia faces in the SEC East. So there's a very good chance that Georgia does everything it needs to do, and it may not get that rematch versus Alabama unless the committee throws them another lifeline in the college football playoff, because the SEC West this year is just going to be very hard to win. In fact, I've been on record as predicting I believe LSU wins the division this year. So that's also part of the practical reasoning why a guy like J.R. Reed talks more about the trophies at stake more so than the opponent to be played. I think that's interesting. All right, so Green Soldier, good to have you back. As I said, stateside here again and on your way. Glad to hear that. Let me, Lee Bridges mentioning Saban's age. I was very proud of myself yesterday. I almost did the old man face app joke involving a picture of Nick Saban on Twitter and decided not to do that. I feel like that took a lot of restraint. I'm very proud of myself for not doing that yesterday. That would have been a cheap shot, and I decided not to take that unprovoked. So I'm actually pretty proud of myself for not doing that yesterday, because I almost did the joke of, wow, looks like Alabama's getting into the face app game here. Here's what Nick Saban will look like with an old man face. And I didn't do it.
Also, don't use that face app. It takes all your data. And
it does. Yeah. Listen, PSA, do not do that. Now, I don't. All these internet phenomenons, I'm not a participant in any of them, which is generally the right way to be. But don't do this when you're essentially giving your social security number over to Russia if you do that.
They probably already have it anyway, but
and Richard Smith also kind of pointing out the same thing there on that. All right, we got to go here. Really good stuff. I'll be back tomorrow. Jeff with us live. We'll talk to him about some of the big issues facing UGA recruiting. Probably a whole lot more from the Georgia coaches and players in terms of their outlook for the upcoming season. Just kind of a fun close out to the week before we get rocking and rolling with practice and DawgNation days of summer and everything else left to come for this countdown to the start of the 2019 year. So y'all have a great day. We'll see you then. By the way, a huge thanks to, before I get to my friends at R.S. Andrews, let me also remind you about the AJC, and I hope you'll go to ajc.com to get your Atlanta news now each and every day. I like to check in throughout the day. It just gives me a chance to kind of know what's going on and paying close attention to kind of everything that's out there. There's obviously a lot going on with the Braves, who they dropped their afternoon game to the Milwaukee Brewers yesterday. There's good Braves coverage at AJC.com. One of the things the AJC does really well, these investigative journalism reports. There's one going on about a caregiver who was found guilty of neglect and had to go on trial, and I guess the jury kind of weighed in on that in a way that was surprising to some. You can check that at AJC.com. And Mark Bradley on the sports side of things also kind of weighing in on the topic of Nick Saban, which we were just addressing earlier. You can get all of your Atlanta news now at AJC.com. Check in throughout the day for Atlanta news now at AJC.com. Also, as I said before, huge thanks to R.S. Andrews for making the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. They do it for us every single day. Air, heating, plumbing, electric. They play all those positions for us here at DawgNation It may be, though, the AC that you're thinking about most this time of year. So get that $99 Smiley tune-up by checking in with our friends at RS Andrews, online at rsandrews.com. You'll have a great day. I'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily once again.